Some bands fall apart quietly, others get destroyed by one person who pulls the strings, makes the decisions, and burns the whole thing down, sometimes on purpose and sometimes without even realizing it. These are 10 music stars who single-handedly destroyed their bands. Number 10. Syd Barrett, Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd formed in London in 1965, and in its earliest incarnation, the band revolved entirely around one person, Roger Keith Barrett, who went by Syd. He wrote the songs, led the performances, and gave the group its psychedelic identity at a moment when that identity was exactly what the London underground scene was looking for. The debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, was released in August 1967 and is still considered one of the foundational documents of psychedelic rock. Barrett wrote almost all of it. The record was made at Abbey Road Studios. In the same building, and during some of the same months, the Beatles were recording Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, two of the most influential records of the decade, made simultaneously under the same roof by two entirely different creative visions. By the time it was released, something had already started to go wrong. The exact combination of factors has been debated for decades. Significant LSD use, an underlying vulnerability to psychosis that the drug may have accelerated. The pressure of sudden fame on someone whose relationship with reality was becoming increasingly fragile. Whatever the cause, Barrett's behavior became erratic in ways the band could not work around. He would stand on stage and detune his guitar string by string until it was unplayable, or repeat the same chord for an entire song, or simply stare at the audience without performing at all. Roger Waters, Richard Wright, and Nick Mason brought in David Gilmour in January 1968 to cover for Barrett at live shows, with the intention of keeping both guitarists in the band. Within weeks, it was clear that wasn't going to work. Barrett's last appearance with Pink Floyd was on January 26, 1968. The band simply stopped picking him up on the way to shows, and the separation became permanent without any formal announcement. Barrett recorded 2 solo albums in 1970, The Madcap Laughs and Barrett, and then withdrew from public life entirely, returning to Cambridge to live with his mother. He occasionally appeared unannounced at Abbey Road during the recording of Wish You Were Here in 1975, and the band did not recognize him at first. He had shaved his head and eyebrows and gained considerable weight. He died on July 7, 2006, from pancreatic cancer. He was 60 years old. Pink Floyd went on to become one of the best-selling acts in music history. The band they became was built on the foundation Barrett had laid, and the absence of the person who built it was something the remaining members acknowledged throughout their career. Wish You Were Here was dedicated in large part to him, a tribute from people who had moved on without being entirely sure they should have. Number 9. Brian Wilson, The Beach Boys. Brian Wilson visited on the Beach Boys was quieter than most on this list, and more complicated, because Wilson was also the primary creative force that made the band great, which means the story of his unraveling is inseparable from the story of their artistic peak. He was born on June 20, 1942, in Inglewood, California, and by the early 1960s was writing and producing records with a sophistication that went far beyond what the surf rock genre he was working in would seem to allow. Pet Sounds, released in May 1966, was a production achievement that influenced every significant rock act that heard it. Paul McCartney has said it was the record that inspired Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The harmonies, the arrangements, the emotional depth of the material. It was unlike anything else being made at the time. But Wilson was already struggling. He had stopped touring in December 1964, overwhelmed by anxiety and what would later be understood as a serious mental illness. By 1967, the Smile album he had been working on, intended as the follow-up to Pet Sounds and described by those who heard the sessions as potentially the most ambitious pop record ever attempted, was abandoned. Wilson's mental state had deteriorated to the point where the project collapsed entirely. The recording sat unreleased for decades, eventually surfacing in partial form before Wilson himself finished and released a completed version in 2004. Through the 1970s and much of the 1980s, Wilson was under the influence and control of therapist Eugene Landy, whose methods were later ruled unethical and whose relationship with Wilson led to Landy being stripped of his psychology license in 1989. The band continued functioning during this period, but without Wilson as a creative center, and the records they made reflected that absence. The version of the Beach Boys that existed through most of the 1970s and 1980s was a touring nostalgia act rather than a creative force, and the responsibility for that transformation rested, in complicated ways, with the person who had made them matter in the first place. Number 8. Roger Waters, Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd appears twice on this list because it had two different people destroy it at two different times, which is unusual even by rock band standards. After Barrett's departure, Waters became the dominant creative force in the band. The Dark Side of the Moon in 1973, Wish You Were Here in 1975, Animals in 1977, and The Wall in 1979 were all driven primarily by Waters' vision and creative control. The commercial and critical success of those albums, The Dark Side of the Moon stayed on the Billboard 200 for 741 weeks, gave Waters a leverage within the band that became increasingly difficult for the other members to navigate. By the time the final cut was released in 1983, the band had become largely a vehicle for Waters' solo artistic vision, with Gilmour, Wright, and Mason contributing as musicians, rather than as creative partners. Wright had effectively been fired by Waters during the Wall sessions, though he remained as a paid musician to avoid contractual complications. The album was credited on its sleeve as A Requiem for the Post-War Dream by Roger Waters, performed by Pink Floyd, which said plainly what Waters believed the actual arrangement to be. After the final cut, Waters announced in December 1985 that he was leaving Pink Floyd, declaring the band to be a spent force. He also filed legal action to prevent the other members from continuing to use the Pink Floyd name. He lost that action. Gilmour, Mason, and Wright, with Wright rejoining as a full member, continued as Pink Floyd and released A Momentary Lapse of Reason in 1987 and The Division Bell in 1994, both of which sold enormously. Waters spent years in legal disputes and public statements questioning their legitimacy. The band he declared dead made two of the best-selling records of the late 1980s and 1990s without him. Richard Wright died on September 15, 2008, in London, from cancer. Nick Mason and David Gilmour have both said publicly that there will be no further Pink Floyd activity, and neither has given any indication of changing that position. Number 7. Axl Rose, Guns N' Roses. Guns N' Roses formed in Los Angeles in 1985 and released Appetite for Destruction in July 1987, which went on to become the best-selling debut album in American music history, eventually selling over 30 million copies worldwide. The original lineup, Rose, Slash, Duff McKagan, Izzy Stradlin, and Steven Adler, had a specific chemistry that the record captured and that nothing produced by any later version of the band has come close to replicating. The original lineup lasted 5 years. Adler was fired in July 1990 after ongoing drug problems made him unable to record. Stradlin resigned in November 1991, citing Rose's increasing control over the band's direction and the difficulty of working under those conditions. Slash left in 1996 after years of creative conflict with Rose. McKagan left the same year. By the time Chinese Democracy was finally released in November 2008, after 14 years in production, a recording budget reported at over $13 million, and a constantly rotating cast of musicians, the band that released it had no original members, except Rose himself. The album debuted at number 3 on the Billboard 200 and sold fewer copies in its first week than Appetite for Destruction had sold in comparable periods decades earlier. Rose had spent 14 years and an enormous amount of money making a record that his original bandmates would not have made with him. The original Guns N' Roses reunited for a tour beginning in 2016 that became one of the highest-grossing concert tours in history, ultimately earning over $500 million. The reunion was its own statement about what the band meant when all 5 original members were in the room together, something no amount of solo control had been able to replicate in the intervening 2 decades. Rose's talent had never been in question. His ability to maintain the relationships that made the band what it was had been the problem, and the reunion demonstrated that the audience had been waiting the entire time for the version of the band he had effectively dismantled. Number 6. Pete Best, The Beatles. Pete Best did not destroy the Beatles through ego or creative conflict. He destroyed his place in them simply by not being as good as what came next. He was the drummer for the Beatles from August 1960 through August 1962, playing with the group through their Hamburg residencies and their early Liverpool shows, and he was present for some of the most formative performances of their career. In June 1962, the Beatles recorded a session at EMI's Abbey Road studios with producer George Martin. Martin's assessment was that Best's drumming was not at the standard the recordings required. In August 1962, the other 3 members asked manager Brian Epstein to inform Best that he was being replaced. He was replaced by Ringo Starr, who had been the drummer for Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and was already well known to the Liverpool music community. Best was not present when the Beatles became the most famous band in human history. He did not share in the royalties, the cultural legacy, or the experience of being part of something that changed music. He worked a number of jobs in Liverpool in the years that followed, eventually forming his own group and recording his own material with modest success. He worked for a time at a Liverpool unemployment office. He wrote a memoir, gave interviews, and appeared at Beatles-related events over the years, with a grace that the circumstances did not strictly require. The particular quality of his situation, being almost there, being so close, being part of it until the precise moment it became what it became, has made him one of the more poignant figures in the history of popular music. When the Beatles' anthology project was released in 1995, Best received a royalty payment from the recordings made during his time with the band, the first significant financial recognition he had received from that period. He has spoken about his experience in interviews over the decades, with a measured tone that has varied between acceptance and a residual sadness that would be unreasonable not to feel. What Best did was simply be not quite right for the band at the moment the band became extraordinary. The destruction was not of the Beatles. They survived and flourished. The destruction was of the life he might have had if one producer's assessment in June 1962 had gone differently. Number 5. Dave Mustaine, Metallica. Dave Mustaine was one of the founding members of Metallica, contributing to the band's earliest material and playing lead guitar through their initial period of development. He was fired from the band in April 1983, just before the recording of their debut album Kill 'Em All, due to behavior that the other members felt was incompatible with the functioning of the group. He was given a bus ticket home to Los Angeles. He went on to form Megadeth, which became one of the most successful heavy metal bands of the following decades. Peace sells. But who's buying? In 1986, So Far, So Good. So What? In 1988, and Rust in Peace in 1990, were records that established Megadeth as a genuine creative force, rather than simply a platform for grievance. Rust in Peace was nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Metal Performance. The commercial and critical standing Megadeth achieved was real and substantial. But Mustaine's relationship with his departure from Metallica became one of the defining features of his public identity for years. He spoke about it in interviews with a bitterness that remained raw decades later, and the awareness that Metallica had become one of the best-selling acts in music history while he was working alongside them, despite Megadeth's own considerable success, was something he processed publicly and with considerable difficulty. The 2004 documentary Some Kind of Monster captured Metallica's internal dynamics at a particularly exposed moment, and Mustaine's participation in parts of that film gave audiences a window into the ongoing weight of his departure. He did not destroy Metallica. They thrived without him and became one of the best-selling acts in history. What he contributed to destroying was his own peace with his own career, spending years measuring Megadeth's genuine achievements against a counterfactual version of his life that could never be confirmed or ruled out. It took decades before he was able to speak about the departure with anything approaching equanimity, and the journey to that point was as public as the departure itself had been. Number 4. Richey Edwards, Manic Street Preachers. Richey Edwards was the rhythm guitarist and primary lyricist of the Manic Street Preachers, the Welsh rock band that formed in Blackwood in 1986. He was not the most technically accomplished musician in the group. James Dean Bradfield handled most of the guitar work and all of the lead vocals, but he was the intellectual and visual center of the band's identity, the person whose ideas shaped what the Manic Street Preachers were making a statement about. His image, the eyeliner, the slogans written on his arms, the intensity of his public presence, was as much a part of what the band communicated as any record they released. The group had made an extraordinary entrance into British rock. Their debut single in 1991 came accompanied by the kind of manifesto-level statement that very few bands had attempted before them, and the music that followed through the early 1990s, confrontational, literary, drawing on a wider range of cultural references than almost anything else on the radio, built them a following that was deeply loyal and unusually engaged. Edwards' lyrics in particular carried a weight and a specificity that separated the band from their contemporaries. On February 1st, 1995, Edwards disappeared from the Embassy Hotel in London, where he had been staying before a planned trip to the United States with Bradfield. His car was found near the Severn Bridge on February 17, 1995. He has never been found. He was declared legally dead in November 2008, 13 years after his disappearance. He was 27 years old at the time he vanished. The Manic Street Preachers continued without him. The Holy Bible, recorded largely from Edwards' lyrics before his disappearance, was released in August 1994 and is considered one of the most intense and uncompromising records in British rock. Everything Must Go, released in 1996 after his disappearance, was their commercial breakthrough, reaching number 2 on the UK Albums Chart and winning the Brit Award for Best British Album. They have continued recording and performing since, and have spoken openly about Edwards throughout their career. The destruction here was not of the band's commercial viability. It was of the specific thing the band had been when all 4 members were present, an entity that has not existed since February 1st, 1995, and that cannot be reconstructed because the person at its center is gone. The Manic Street Preachers have handled his absence with more public honesty than most bands manage with most situations, acknowledging that they continue, because continuing is what they decided to do, while never pretending that what they are now is the same as what they were. They have kept a place for him in everything they have made since, which is its own kind of answer to a question that has never officially been closed. Number 3. Michael Jackson, The Jackson 5. The Jackson 5 signed with Motown Records in 1969. And between 1969 and 1975, they had a run of singles that established them as one of the most commercially successful acts on the label. I Want You Back, ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There all reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The group, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, and Michael, had a chemistry and an energy that reflected years of performing together before their Motown success, shaped by their father Joseph Jackson's relentless drive to put his children on a professional stage. Michael was 11 years old when I Want You Back reached number 1. By the time he was in his early 20s, it was clear that his solo career had a trajectory that nothing involving the group could match. Off the Wall in 1979 produced by Quincy Jones, reached number 3 on the Billboard 200 and produced 4 top 10 singles. Thriller in 1982 became the best-selling album in history, eventually selling over 66 million copies worldwide. It won 8 Grammy Awards at the 1984 ceremony. The gap between what Michael was becoming and what the group could offer him as a context was growing wider with every release. The Jacksons. The group had changed their name after leaving Motown for Epic Records in 1975, when Jermaine stayed behind, continued as a functioning act through the 1970s and into the 1980s. But the gravitational pull of Michael's solo career made every group project feel secondary. The Victory Tour in 1984 was the last major Jackson family undertaking, and Michael's participation in it was reluctant and driven partly by family obligation. He had not destroyed the Jacksons maliciously. He had simply become something so much larger than any group context could contain that the group ceased to be meaningful around him. That is its own kind of destruction, even when nobody intended it. Number 2. Liam Gallagher, Oasis. Oasis formed in Manchester in 1991, with Liam Gallagher as lead vocalist and his older brother Noel as primary songwriter and lead guitarist. The relationship between the two brothers was the creative engine of the band, and also its primary liability. They had a genuine musical partnership that produced Definitely Maybe in 1994 and What's the Story? Morning Glory. In 1995, 2 of the best-selling British rock albums of the decade. And they had a personal relationship that generated a level of conflict that was extraordinary even by rock band standards. The public arguments, the cancelled shows, the physical altercations backstage, the interviews in which each brother said things about the other that could not easily be walked back. These were features of Oasis's existence from the beginning and continued through to the end. Noel had quit the band and returned multiple times before the final break. The tension was not incidental to the band's identity. It was part of what made them compelling to watch. But it was also genuinely destructive in ways that shortened what could have been a longer run. Noel left the band on August 28, 2009, following what he described as a backstage altercation with Liam before a show at the Rock en Seine festival in Paris. He issued a statement saying he could no longer work with Liam. That was the end of Oasis. Liam subsequently formed BDI with the remaining members, and Noel launched a successful solo career under the name Noel Gallagher's High Flying Birds. Both careers found audiences, but neither found the scale that Oasis had occupied. Liam has spoken about the breakup with considerable public feeling in the years since, alternating between expressions of genuine regret and provocations directed at his brother that made reconciliation seem unlikely. After years of public back and forth, the two brothers announced a reunion tour in August 2024. Whatever happened between them, the audience never stopped wanting what the two of them made together. Number 1. John Lennon, The Beatles. This requires careful framing because John Lennon's role in the end of the Beatles was one piece of a complicated situation involving 4 strong personalities, accumulated personal tensions, the death of manager Brian Epstein in August 1967, and a business dispute over management that became the legal mechanism through which the dissolution was finalized. But Lennon's introduction of Yoko Ono into the inner workings of the band, her constant presence in the studio during the recording of the White Album in 1968, her participation in business discussions, the way her presence altered the dynamic of a group that had functioned for years as a closed system, was the single most disruptive change in the band's final years. And the other members, particularly Paul McCartney and George Harrison, were explicit about the difficulty of it. Harrison walked out of the sessions on January 10, 1969, during what became known as the Get Back sessions, telling the others he was leaving the band before returning days later. The footage from those sessions, eventually released as the documentary Let It Be in 1970 and revisited in Peter Jackson's Get Back in 2021, showed a group under visible strain. Lennon's signing with manager Alan Klein in 1969, over McCartney's strong objection, with Harrison and Starr initially joining Lennon, led directly to the legal disputes that made the formal end of the Beatles both inevitable and bitter. McCartney had wanted his father-in-law Lee Eastman to handle the band's business affairs. The Klein-Eastman conflict became the legal dimension of what had already become an irreparable personal situation. Lennon's private declaration in September 1969 that he was leaving the Beatles was kept quiet for months at the request of Klein, who was negotiating a record contract at the time. McCartney's public announcement of his departure in April 1970 is often cited as the moment the Beatles ended publicly, but the decision had been made months earlier. The four Beatles spent years in litigation after the formal dissolution. Lennon was shot and killed outside his apartment building at the Dakota in New York City on December 8, 1980. He was 40 years old. The Beatles had made 12 studio albums between 1963 and 1970 and had fundamentally altered the course of popular music. The person who did the most to end it was also one of the two people most responsible for what it had been. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button and subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting.